Anna China. I'm a professor of education in the Department of Educational Studies and the director of the Center for Ethics and Social Justice. I'd like to introduce Melissa Benn. She's a close friend, Goldsmith's, a writer, Benn. Books of education include The School Wars, The Battle of Britain's Education, and Life Lessons, The Case for a National Education Service. Her presentation tonight will be based on a more recent book to which she has contributed, Teacher Education in Crisis, The State, the Market and the Universities. That was in 2023.
Yeah, that came out at the end of last year, Bloomsbury. Yeah,
Yeah. So, hand it over to you.
Okay.
You're going to talk for a while.
Anna asked me to speak on the basis of this chapter that I wrote. So if I could explain what I was asked to do and how it was actually a really interesting piece of work. So Viv Ellis, who's at King's, was editing a book on what's happened to teacher education, which some of you in the room may know about the reforms to teacher education. And he asked me to write a framing chapter looking at what happened to education overall in the last 14 years. And in his email, he said the immortal words, "You should be able to knock it up in an afternoon." 6 weeks later, 3 months actually, it took me to write the chapter. And actually it involved me in a wholly unexpected piece of detective work. So I've written about education for a long time. I started out as a campaigner. I suppose I come from a tradition of campaigning, and that would be, to be honest, part of my story. But as a parent, I got involved in campaigning around 2005. Anyway, so as a campaigner, and I've written several books about education, but I thought, I didn't think I could knock it up in an afternoon, but I thought I knew the landscape of the last 14 years because I had engaged to some extent with the Go-Bites from 2010 onwards. When I wrote School Wars, I wrote the book, and then it came out the same week that the free school programme began under Rachel Wolf. And I ended up debating with Rachel Wolf and others. And then I went around the country. I'm not quite sure why I did. I think it must be the bit of me that's a politician monkey. Anyway, I ended up going around and arguing with all the emerging new education establishment about comprehensive reform, what they were doing and all the rest of it. So I was quite immersed for a few years in what they were doing. But when I came to look at this piece of work, which was tracing it over, let's say it's a decade and a half, I was really quite surprised at how much everything had changed, and also how worrying it seemed to me. So I want to share my detective work and my worry with you. So the questions that I was looking at is who now runs our system, who has influence and what kind of influence do they have, what do they believe, and what do we think about what they believe? And also, given that we're now at the point where we're probably going to have a Labour government, I don't think you can ever say for sure. We're certainly going to have a change of government, but what kind of reform is possible following the major changes of the last 14 years? So I'm going to do this as briefly as I can so that we can have a conversation, but I'll do it in 4 ways. First, a brief contextualization, because I think we have to understand what has happened over the last 14 years in the landscape of post-war education, but that's going to be really brief. And if you're all education students, you're going to know it anyway, or if you're all education knowledgeable about it. Then I want to talk about what I identified as the key ideology behind the new education establishment, and then what I worked out from that, looking at what they really believed and their arguments. I then sort of, in that way you do, where you go for a walk or a swim or a run, and suddenly you think, no, what's really important is what they believe is really important, but what they don't talk about is just as important. So I will also identify the silences around the new education establishment. Then just a bit of fun, looking at who are the key influencers now. And I spent yesterday kind of updating my knowledge, which is not huge, but it's quite keen in the people who are running things. And of course, they're now running things separate, as it were, from an accountable local and national state. So it's a bit like identifying sort of celebrities or musicians or something like that. And then finally, I want to end with what I call now the two narratives around the last 15 years. And that to me really interests me. And then on to that point about what now. So brief context, this is where, I'm sorry, I'm going to say things you all know far too well. But if we look at the divide, the 1944 to 76 post-war settlement, which was based on a strong relationship between government, local authorities and schools, and the trade unions, and particularly the NUT, had a much bigger role in what was going on in government and local government. And there was a joke that if you wanted to know about education in the late 60s or early 70s, there was some club in London where you could go and you would be permanent secretary of the DFE, having a drink with the chief officer of all the local authorities and the general secretary of the NUT. Well, that certainly wouldn't be the case now. You wouldn't be finding those people having much influence at all. I think then the period from 76 onwards, James Callaghan's Ruskin speech, the growing distrust of teachers, growing distrust of the secret garden of the curriculum and of local authorities. 1988, the Education Reform Act, Baker, which began greater centralisation, undermining of local authority, beginning of independent state schools, city technology colleges, grant maintained schools, which never really took off. And then segueing into the Blair Brown era. Now, look, every single political era had a different feel about it. The New Labour era, impressive funding, the Edwards 2007 to 2010 period, which was extended schools, every child matters, was, I think, probably the height of New Labour's achievements. But of course, academisation was a passion, particularly of Blair, who I don't think Blair ever really understood state education, and I don't think it's because he was privately educated, but I think he had a distrust of local authorities. He didn't like the comprehensive movement. There's lots of anecdotal and policy evidence, and academies were his way of moving it forward. So we come to 2010, to what we would call the traditional revolutionary era, which I'm going to be looking at, and absolutely shaped by Michael Gove, who had prepared for 3 years with Dominic Cummings as his special advisor and Sam Friedman as his policy advisor, and had, I think Cameron became the leader of the Conservative Party, was it 2005? And this was a new gang, and Gove was at the heart of it. I find Michael Gove absolutely fascinating in ways that are, not entirely positive. And Michael Gove had been thinking about what he wanted to do with education, and he had revolutionary ideas about structural change. And he also had highly traditional views about the curriculum and exams and assessment and so on. So Gove comes in, mass academisation. Unlike Tony Blair, as you will also all know, Tony Blair's the idea was going into areas they saw had been poorly served by local authorities and picking them off and creating corporately sponsored academies, like the most famous being Moscow. But Gove came in and just basically gave money to already successful schools, a proportion of local authority money. So it was a complete structural revolution, the beginning of free schools, which were marketed very cleverly as parent power, a new form of local democracy. It's quite interesting to follow this free school programme. Don't hold me to this, but I'm pretty sure that the actual department in government has now been closed down, and free schools, which are, after all, only academies starting from scratch, are now run by established chains and groups of schools already. So that it's no longer, as the kind of people that I met in 2011 and 12, parents in Hackney who wanted a music school, parents in some parts of the country that weren't happy with the local school, and so on. So all this led to further declining local authority involvement and also confusing fragmentation. It was soon clear that academies couldn't stand alone. They were known confusingly as SAT, stand alone. trusts, which of course is SATs is also then primary school exams, and it led to the drive to maths, multi-academy trusts. But even the growth of the multi-academy trusts have stalled, and in 2014, I think, Gove decided to create regional school commissions. So what you've got, if you look at it as an administrative problem, you have local authorities that still largely run isn't the right word, but are the family that sort of provide the frame for a lot of primary schools and a few secondary schools, and you have regional school commissioners, which may even have been renamed as something else now. And in all the things that I've read about what even the more reasonable Govads think, it's a mess. And that's probably something that Labour, if it is going to go into government, is thinking about. Not that we know much about what Labour's thinking about in terms of education. Now, Gove was sacked in 2014, and I think most Secretary of States since have really sort of patched up the system, and I think have been of declining. This is being recorded, so I'm going to be very tactful, of declining impact, I think we can say. And I think it is quite interesting that now a big, a Gove statement was, I'm going to just pull up this entire system by its roots and change it because I know what's wrong with state education. And Gillian Keegan stands up at the Tory Party conference and says, I'm going to ban phones in schools, which from what I gather is they're banned in most places anyway. So I think that shows you something about how the Tories have run out of ideas. They're soon going to run out of people. They keep changing their ministers so often. I think Michelle Donlan, was she Education Secretary for about 3 days or something? Yeah. Anyway. 9. 9 since. 9 days, right, okay. So that's the kind of background of the Gove era, but I became very interested in what were the ideas behind that. And I think those ideas are still going, and I identified in this chapter 3 shaping ideas, and the first is that progressive education is the root of all educational evil. And what began to really anger me when I looked at this, there's a writer, Gove would make very clever speeches. He made a speech in 2013 to the Social Market Foundation. It's an absolute amazingly good in that it's witty, it has references to Jade Goody and Gramsci, it's completely disingenuous, it's a beautifully crafted speech, but it's arguing against progressive, it's exaggerating, distorting progressive education. Somebody called Robert Peel, I think, who wrote Progressively Worse, The Burden of Bad Ideas in School, with a good example, Toby Young on social media, Catherine Burlesing. They all took progressive education, which after all has this very long and honourable tradition, and they turned it into a cartoon tradition. So they completely ignore or distort the work of Dewey, Winifred Mercier, who's a teacher educator I became very interested in, and when I read of the lessons that she was running, I think in her Leeds Institute in the early 20th century, just extraordinary examples of sort of complex teaching. The Cloudon Report and Robin Alexander and the Cambridge Primary Review, which it was just the most fantastic set of ideas. So, but the Govites said this is the blob, and they are responsible for chaos in school. And what they like to do is to pick on a number of cartoon type failures. So you would have the William Tyndale affair, which was a long time ago. You would have Rising Hill, which was quite a sort of interesting school. I don't know if you've read the Lila Bird book about it, but they would take that and they would take places of chaos and failure and say that's progressive education, which is not the case, not true. The second really key Govite idea was that poverty is no excuse for educational failure, and that poverty and the lack of social mobility can be overcome by a powerful knowledge curriculum and a certain kind of teacher. And a lot of these ideas came from America, so there was Teach for America and it became Teach First Here, which is still going strong, the charter school movement. And I think it's impossible to exaggerate the evangelical quality of a lot of these ideas and the people who promoted them. And it is still a very, very strong element in what you might call the new right education ideas. And I think we have, those of us who don't think it works and feel uneasy about it, I've always thought we've never quite mounted a good enough argument against it. So if you look at organisations like the Ambition Institute, which I'm going to come on to talk about, or you look at Parents and Teachers for Excellence, which is an organisation set up after Gove's sacking to keep these ideas going, it's all identifying powerful knowledge, dedicated teachers, helping disadvantaged children to access the best that has been thought and said, and to, it's a very meritocratic view, and it's in their view, and I remember Gove stood up in Parliament in 2010, and I remember when he stood up and he mocked Ed Balls and his Department for Children and Families, and he mocked Harriet Harman and said, do you know, under New Labour, more young people went from the honourable members of School St Paul's to Oxford and Cambridge than went from state schools. And of course, I remember hearing that and thinking that really does not sound good. I don't think it's the only measure, but I just don't think the figures have improved at all after 14 years ago, even by that metric. But for Govism, the ultimate success is probably a child, an ethnic minority child on free school meals and through inner city comprehensively gets to an Oxbridge college. That is their definition of success. And in a way, and allow me to say a bit of journalistic character exaggeration, to sort of let the rest go and frankly. And then the third problem they identified was that they picked on, attacked, marginalised what they argued were a set of failed liberal institutions, and that's the blob again. So local authorities, universities, university education, and the trade unions. Gove treated the unions like an enemy army. I think someone like Mary Boosted, who's a terrific trade union leader, actually said that. They further decimated local authorities, which had already been weakened from 1976 onwards. And I think it is important to remember that it didn't all start with the Tories. And then the long assault on university education continues and has been revved up by this market review, which is why I wrote this framing chapter. And now come to the silences, and I became, as I said, very interested in what the silences were. What you never find the new educational establishment talking about, they've been forced to now by a number of developments, but in the first decade, never talked about school funding as an issue in terms of lack of achievement, never talked about the hierarchical schools landscape, private schools, grammars, selective faith schools. The Sutton Trust have recently brought out a report showing the 20 top selective state schools are faith schools, and that's all to do with admissions policy, which I did a lot of work on in the New Labour era, and which is really kind of, it's loosened to the point now where schools are able to do all sorts of things with their intake, partly because they're under such pressure to do well in exams. This was never discussed by the new education establishment. Stagnant wages for teachers, excessive workload, which is now identified finally as one of the biggest problems, or the impact of broader economic inequality and the growth of poverty. And of course, remember, all of this happened in the austerity years. Sorry, that is a very important point. So all these policy changes plus austerity sort of created so many problems. So, as I said, looking at these ideas overall, looking at the silences around them, what's most striking is their consistent rhetorical emphasis on the education of the disadvantaged. And as I say, I don't think we've ever really managed to argue against that well enough. And it's a very similar to the Johnsonian liberal elite and trust, liberal elite versus red wall divide. It's the same kind of set of arguments, that there's a group of people who are doing all right themselves, and they want to take away the chance for working class children in deprived areas to do really, really well. And they say that's the problem of the kind of left liberals, rather than the problem of, I don't know, isn't Eton a bit of a problem in that? Isn't selective education in Buckinghamshire, Lincolnshire and Kent a bit of a problem for children from working class backgrounds? No, it's all the problem of people who teach at Goldsmiths and people like me, frankly. So now I want to look, my third area is just to look at who are the new influential people in the new education establishment. I do think this is quite fascinating, and I've tried to do it in a little bit of an entertaining cartoon way, because obviously there are numerous people. But I've got categories here, what I call the big money men. So those that directly fund schools and are running schools and influencing schools completely outside any democratic oversight. And a person who I've become more and more interested in, partly because he has gone on to take control of many other parts of our civic society, is Paul Marshall, who set up ARC schools. He's now bought GB News. He runs Unheard, the website, which I shall say more about when we turn the camera and the microphone off. And apparently he wants to buy the Telegraph. So he is somebody with a lot of money, but I think we really can't underestimate the influence of art schools in this landscape. They're still going strong, like ARC, Teach First, so on. But big money behind. You know, there are individuals. When Gove came to the Department of Education, he appointed a new board. That board has now changed, but it was a lot of corporate figures, a lot of hedge fund people, and those people are now much more involved in education. They wouldn't have been involved in education at all in the 70s, or even, I would have thought, under Thatcher, to be honest. But they're now central to it. And Lord Nash, who brought Pimlico Academy, actually under New Labour, because I wrote an article in The Guardian about it, I had to go and interview him. It was a very uncomfortable meeting. And he then ran a number of private schools and so on, but he came in and took over Pimlico Academy. So there's so many big money men now in education. I mean, I don't know if there are many big money women. There probably are, but they're largely sort of city men. Then you've got what I call the big managers. So really, we're looking here at the influential MAT leaders, highly paid. Dan Moynihan, Sir Dan Moynihan, Harris, who is his salary is now just nudging £500,000 a year. Colin Hall, who ran my old school, Holland Park, which was a SAT, a single academy trust. I think he was on 200k at least, but in the end had to resign because of problems within the school. Powerful academies. So, you know, some of them have quite interesting leaders, like Oasis, Steve Chalk. Steve Chalk is quite an interesting leader. John Coles, highly paid, United Learning, but actually more on the sort of progressive side. But I don't think we can underestimate academy, and particularly multi-academy trust influence with government. Schools Week did analyse guests at a Downing Street reception when Theresa May was Prime Minister, and it was basically the big academies with tiny numbers of people in the maintained sector represented. And during the pandemic, when I was doing a lot of articles about heads and schools and how they were coping, I would speak to heads, particularly in the north, who were just furious with the government only talking to certain multi-academy trusts and multi-academy trust heads. And so I think you'd have to be more well connected in this world than I am, but I think there's an enormous amount of this kind of thing that goes on behind the scenes. And the thing is, it is not democratically transparent in any way. Right, next category we call the big tweeters. That's very polite. You know, social media, you can't underestimate the role. Social media has changed everything, and it has changed education. And again, like the liberal elite red wall divide, it's pitched these very, very certain new educational establishment figures against others with different views. Personally, I think it's better to take the argument off Twitter. Like many people, I kind of got drawn into it when I published School Wars, and Twitter, as it was then, was just beginning. I think it's all a sort of time and energy trap. And anyway, we shouldn't be letting people with 400,000 followers be deciding what the policy of our schools are. But the big figures there, I think the biggest figure at the moment is probably Tom Bennett, who is the behaviour czar, and of course Warwick Mansell, who's a brilliant investigative journalist, and you really should look at his website, Education Uncovered, if you haven't already. He has argued very well that because of Tom Bennett's big social media following, that has helped him to get government contracts. He's very, very influential. He's written books. His behaviour theories are sort of reign supreme with this government. Another big tweeter was Toby Young, but unfortunately, you know, he lived by the sword, you die by the sword. He got done for very distasteful late night tweets. I was listening to a programme about how to manage your reputation online. It's called When It Hits the Fan by the and they were saying one thing you should never do is tweet late at night or when you've had a drink. And I suspect that some people may have forgotten that rule. Catherine Birbalsingh is another one. Then you get quite interesting figures like Sam Friedman, who first worked for Go, but it's quite an ambiguous figure, and it's very much of this establishment, still involved with art, involved with Teach First at the Institute of Government, very, very influential, but a kind of semi-critic of this whole revolution. So, and I suspect more of a Blairite than a Tory, and probably, to come on to my final point, probably going to be quite influential with the new Labour government. Then finally, no, I've got another two, the revolving door men, and actually revolving door women as well. And there are, and I should have brought a kind of mind map. There's a series of figures who've moved through think tanks like Policy Exchange, Public First, special advisor roles, government advisory roles, and people like Jonathan Simons, Ed Dorrell, who used to be at the TES, John Blake, who's now at the Office for Students, Sam Friedman, Matt Hood, Rachel Wolfe, who then went to set up free schools, then went on to co-write with Manura Mirza the 2019 Johnson Manifesto, Sir Ian Balcombe, who I can't remember, he's held a number of roles. So they're really very influential, but it's interesting, it is quite a circular set of appointments and influence. Then the big entrepreneurs, it's what I call the setting up of the shadow state. If you undermine, defund, attack and destroy something like university education, then what happens is that you get organisations, sort of startups, that offer teacher development and so on. And they, in true NE fashion, bring together corporate figures, school chains, influencers. So 2 examples, the Ambition Institute, which provides professional development, and who is on its board. Just for an example, it's got Credit Suisse representatives, Walt Disney representatives, lots of the big powerful Matts, ARC, Stan Friedman, Matt Hood. The Oak Academy, set up during the pandemic, which was set up to provide bite-sized lessons. There's quite an interesting story to follow about the Oak Academy, because I think there was a point where Henry de Zoot, if it's pronounced like that, from Dragon's Den came in. There was an idea it might be floated as a private company with potential for profit. That was stopped. And actually, John Coles from United Learning resigned from Oak Academy because he felt that it was, in a way, bringing in this sort of drip feed kind of airplane meal curriculum. So it was just constricting even further teachers' autonomy in the classroom. But Oak Academy is headed up by Matt Hood, Sir Ian Balcombe's on the board, Henry de Zoot, Sean Harford, who I think was at Ofsted. So I'm not a teacher, but if you were my class, I would say, honestly, it's really interesting to go and do further research into all the people who are now running education. And I think the more knowledge that we have, the more likely we are to be able to influence what comes next. So my final point is what next? And what really interests me about this period is what I call the 2 narratives. And I've just for Forum, which is a journal of supporting comprehensive education, we brought out a new publication which is trying to we've got about 10 or 12 contributions, trying to put forward a genuine set of alternative ideas about education. And I've written the concluding chapter, and what was really clear about it was that if you look at all the narratives of the people who contributed to our Forum volumes, so it was Diane Ray from Cambridge, Mary Boosted, David Wolf and Anne West from the LSC, representative Social Education Association, Alistair McConville from Rethinking Assessment. What they all argued was, in a way, this is a system more or less in crisis. It's not working. And we know also from the figures on teacher retention, teacher recruitment, teacher retention, the state of buildings, the vast gap between the kind of pay at the top and pay of teachers and support staff, particularly in some of these academies. Really, the gap is quite shocking. There's so many ways in which so many people on the ground think this is a system that's not working. Teacher autonomy constrained, a third of students, what the Association of School and College Leaders called forgotten third, failing the new draconian, much harder GCSEs, not getting above level 4, and so on. So that's one narrative that I'm sure everyone in Goldsmiths is quite familiar with. But the other narrative, when I went to look at how education is represented in the mainstream, it's represented a massive success. So the Times Education Commission, which is quite an interesting commission, but it broadly says marvellous the things that the government has done. The Economist had a whole feature on the strange success of England's school system. Conservative Home, which you might expect it to, saying the one standout success of the last 14 years is the Tories' education policy. Jonathan Simons argued, I think only on Twitter only 2 days ago, look at the PISA results, and we're better than Finland now. Because, they've always had a thing about Finland, the whole Finland. I try not to mention Finland because it's too mentioned in all these discussions. But I'd be surprised if our system was better than Finland, but it depends what you're looking at. And of course, the PISA results are very, if you dive into those, which I did for this talk, it's quite interesting. Well, 2002, we seemed to do quite well, I think, on maths, science, maths and reading, but it turns out that a third of our schools didn't take part, so we don't actually meet the sample for the PISA results. And then if you look at other aspects of it, like happiness, we are right at the bottom of we are literally right at the bottom. So the Educational Policy Institute, not a particularly radical organisation, said the UK now has the second lowest average life satisfaction of 15-year-olds across OECD countries. Well, I don't think that's a great success, I must say. So, final word, possible Labour government. When I was writing this chapter, when I was thinking about these things, I became quite worried about who is Labour listening to. Is the new educational establishment, which is not stupid, they know, well, none of us know that the Tories are finished, but everybody seems to think the Tories are finished. So if I were a sort of Blairite Govite whose life had been, in this world, I would be moving towards Bridget Phillipson, and I would be saying to her, these are the things that you need to do. Now, I don't know who they were talking to. I do know that they're not talking much to those to the left of centre, but then, of course, anything that smacks to them of Corbynism, the narrative, I don't need to go into it. I think three clear policy wins that the Labour government will bring in. They'll make some reform to Ofsted. Bridget Phillipson said she'll get rid of single word judgment, but there's so many other reforms that need to be made to Ofsted. They will reform assessment, because Rethinking Assessment is a powerful group, a mix of private and state schools, and it's led by Peter Hyman, who was Blair's speechwriter, who I think is now advising Keir Starmer. They will do that, and I think the argument about a broader curriculum, arts, music, and so on is something that I can see that Labour feels strongly about. But in terms of structure, academisation, the behaviour, I haven't really talked about that, but another new education establishment is this, really what they call warm strict, that some people would say is just too strict, isolation booths, punishment booths, and so on. I don't know what Labour take is on that. So I leave you with worry in my mind that those who have taken over in an unaccountable way a loss of our education system will unduly influence the next Labour government, and I'll stop there. Thank you.